imagine Jacob second-guessing himself. Here he is leaving the land of Canaan. The land of Canaan was the land that God had promised to Abraham. The land of Canaan was the land that God wanted Isaac to settle in. And now, just because Joseph had been taken into Egypt as a slave, now he's supposed to leave the land of Canaan, the promised land, and go to visit? Or was he supposed to stay there? Or what? What am I doing? Why am I going in this direction? What's the purpose of it all? Have you ever asked those questions? That's when you need to take time to meet with God. Because God is the one, and the only one really, who can reveal his plans to you and give you assurance that you are living in the center of his perfect will. And if you're not living in the center of God's perfect will, you are not experiencing God's best for your life. So Jacob opens up. He says, am I in the right place? What am I doing here? And God says to Jacob, do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. And then God told Jacob what God was going to do. There are 4 specific things. First of all, I will make you into a great nation. Those words must have sounded familiar to Jacob, because that's what God told Abraham. That's what God told Isaac. And now God was telling Jacob the same thing. Ah, yes, this sounds God-like. This sounds like what God said to my dad and my grandfather. I will make you into a great nation. God wants Israel to be a great nation. For granted, there are only 70 of us right now, but one day God is going to make us into a great nation. Second thing that God said to Jacob, I will go down to Egypt with you. Not only was God going to make Jacob into a great nation, Israel into a great nation, God was going to go down to Egypt with Jacob. This is a beautiful song. It's in the German language. But I grew up hearing my grandma sing it. It was a song that basically said, if you don't go with me, I don't want to go on this journey. And they sang it every time they got in the vehicle. I'm not going to take this journey without knowing that God is with me. Is that how you live your life? It's the way I want to live my life. That whenever I go somewhere, whenever I spend time or do something, that I want to know that I'm going and the presence of God is going with me. And God comes to Jacob and he says, don't be afraid to go to Egypt because I'm going with you. I'm not going to leave you alone. My presence is with you. You're doing the right thing by going to Egypt. What an encouragement that must have been. And then thirdly, God says to him what he really wanted to hear. I will surely bring you back again. You're not going to Egypt to live forever. You're going to Egypt, and I will surely bring you back again. That's the promise of the Exodus before they even got to Egypt. I will surely bring you back again, God says. And the fourth thing that God says is, Joseph's hand will close your eyes. Now, we don't understand those words, it's not our common lingo. But basically, what God was saying is, when you die, and somebody needs to close your eyelids to show that you're dead so we don't... Have you ever seen somebody's eyes when they were dead? They're not very pleasant to look at. So the mortician closes the eyelids and they look like they're asleep in the casket. Right? said to Jacob that Joseph was going to close his eyes, that means you are going to be in a close relationship with Joseph, and Joseph's going to be there when you die, and he will close your eyes. He will take care of you when you die. So God was saying, I will make you a great nation. I will go down to Egypt with you. In other words, I will make you great. My presence will be with you. I will bring you back again, and your son will be close to you. Those are beautiful reassurances that God gave to Jacob on the way to Egypt. Number 2, Israel's sons took Jacob all they had to Egypt. Look at verse 5 to 7. Jacob left Beersheba, and he took his sons with him, their children and their wives, and they took them in the carts that Pharaoh had provided for them to take for traveling. And Jacob and all his offspring went to Egypt. His sons brought all their possessions, and they brought all of his offspring to Egypt. Now, when they say they brought all their possessions, there was a reason for this. Jacob and his sons had a special occupation. They were shepherds. And as shepherds, they needed to kind of be self-contained in the wilderness. And they weren't really expecting Pharaoh to understand all the needs that they would have in the wilderness. So they thought that better than relying on Pharaoh, it would be better to take all of their stuff with them. So when they moved, they didn't pay attention to Pharaoh's words, we'll provide for you. They brought all their stuff with them to Egypt so that they would be self-contained. So, we're down to verse 8. They made a list of Jacob's family who went to Egypt. Now, I want you to notice a few things about this list. First of all, we're not sure who made it. It's possible that Moses wrote it in afterwards, after the story had actually happened. That's likely. Or it's possible that Joseph wrote it down. But we're not sure exactly who wrote it down, but the record is there, and it's very helpful. It tells us the names of everyone in the family, but it does it in a special way. It emphasizes, it emphasizes the men. It emphasizes the sons and the grandsons. The granddaughters are not mentioned, but one daughter is mentioned. Jacob's daughter Dinah is mentioned. And as far as we know, that's the only daughter he had. But it mentions the names of Jacob's descendants who went to Egypt, and that was everybody. So we have kind of a record of how this story begins. Remember, way back, it was Abraham, and there was Ishmael, but Ishmael and Hagar went away, and then there was Abraham and Isaac. Then Isaac has 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau went away, and now you have Abraham and Isaac, Jacob and Esau, and Esau's gone, so you have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But when you get to Jacob, it spreads out from one person to 12 sons in the family. And those 12 sons have sons of their own. So they go from being, first of all, a man with a son, then a man with a son, then a man with 12 sons, and those 12 sons become the leaders of 12 tribes. So eventually God is expanding this family into a nation. It lists the sons that Jacob had with Leah, that was his first wife, verses 8 to 15. It lists the sons that Jacob had with Zilpah. Zilpah was was Leah's servant. And we remember earlier in Genesis where Leah said that her husband should sleep with, or Jacob should sleep with Zilpah so she could have more children. And then verses 19 to 22, Rachel had sons, and then Rachel was given a servant as well. Bilhah is her name, and she had sons. So all of these coming together. Now there's an interesting thing back in verse 26 and 27. All those who went to Egypt with Jacob, those who were his direct descendants, not counting his sons' wives, numbered 66 persons. Now, I've gone through this list carefully. Took a little time with it. When you want it to be 66 persons, you know what you have to do? You leave out Dinah. That's the daughter of Jacob. And you leave out Joseph, and you leave out his 2 sons. So you leave out 4 people. Because Joseph and his 2 sons were already considered to be in Egypt, and Dinah was not a son. So you have 4 people left out, and then it's 66 people. But when you, in verse 27, when it says 70 in all, he's added Dinah, and he's added Joseph and his 2 sons, then you get the 70. So that's why those two verses come up with different numbers. Then we arrive at verse 28. Jacob made arrangements to meet with Joseph. Notice who he sends on ahead. He sends Judah ahead. Why does he send Judah ahead? Because through the course of history, Jacob has learned something. He can't trust his other older sons. He has to trust Judah. And Judah goes ahead of him, and his task is to talk to Joseph and get Joseph ready to welcome them as they're coming. So Jacob and his family are coming this way, and Joseph comes this way to meet them and guide them to where Goshen is. They're in a land that they aren't familiar with. Where in the world is Goshen? So they want Joseph to meet up with them and guide them to that, give them directions to Goshen. And then Joseph came, and his idea was not really primarily to give them directions. His idea was, I want to see my dad. And when they saw each other, they hugged each other and they wept. Because it had been many, many years since they saw each other. And Jacob says something significant to Joseph in verse 30. And I don't know about you, but this verse reminds me of a New Testament passage. Do you remember in the Christmas story, near the end of the Christmas story, where there's an old man, Simeon? And Simeon was in the temple and when Mary and Joseph walk in with baby Jesus. And Simeon takes up baby Jesus in his arms and he says, "Now I'm prepared to die, for my eyes have seen your salvation." That statement is very similar to what Jacob says here in verse 30. "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you, Joseph, are still alive." The climax, the highlight of his life, is actually seeing the son that he thought was dead for over 20 years was really alive. To get to see Joseph was the highlight of his old life. So what had God done? God had brought a man who thought he was going to die in Canaan, all the way to Egypt to see his younger son. God has provided a land for them to work in. God has provided favor with Pharaoh. God has provided, most of all, the reuniting of Jacob as father with Joseph as son. And you know what? I believe that's the way to make an elderly man happy. Mm-hmm. Miriam's dad is going to be 89 today. And you know, when we asked him what he wanted for his birthday, you know what he said? I want you all to come together for a meal, and I want us to take a picture. That's what he wanted for his birthday. He wasn't much concerned about any material thing. He's going to get a few things, but I won't tell you what they are. He's going to get a few things, but that his family come together and that they have a picture, that was meaningful to him. And I thought, that's not far off from Jacob, is it? That my family is together and that we can rejoice in that. Can I ask you a question? Do you have a family member who longs to see you? Or you long to see them? Don't put it off. I talked to a lady whose daughter had just passed away. And she looked at me and she said, whatever you do, spend time with your parents. Because they love you. And if you're gone or they're gone, you'll miss them or they'll miss you. This is a mom who had lost her daughter in a car accident when the daughter was 25 years old. God has made families for a reason. He wants us to treasure our families. If you have a family member, love them, treasure them. If you can't be there, talk to them over the phone or over Facebook or whatever. But treasure your family because God works through family.